Like Cheryl said, one of my roles is, for about the last 8 months, I've been the lead PI at the Andrews. And my background, I'm trained as a philosopher, and specifically in environmental ethics. But I work very, very closely, almost completely these days, with ecologists and social scientists. And I work very much at, and you'll see this in the work I'll present, at the interface of those things. So it's always interesting for me, because when I hear the things that you're interested in, and I think about the questions that are kind of in the ether today, I have my own filter, and I think you guys are talking about ethics. And I know you don't want to, and I know you have like really elaborate mechanisms that allow you to sort of push it up, but you're talking about ethics. And so one of the reasons I tell myself is because then I realize I'm in the right room, and it's okay. I'm not one of these people who just showed up accidentally at the meeting. I do have to say, I feel a little bit like Clint Eastwood with this empty chair right next to me. No, I like it. I think I like it. So I think what you'll see, and I want to say some general things and then just give you some examples of some work that I've done with some colleagues. Mostly these are things in Michigan, because I came here from Michigan State 8 months ago. So this is work that's remaining there. And I don't mean these examples as something you could just do, but I want to inspire ideas about how we could come up with different ways of thinking through these very serious and pernicious problems. But I think you'll see there's a little bit of a different wrinkle in it with regard to sort of my approach. So the most important demand, I think, is just clear thinking. And I mean, academics of all people, I mean, some of us make careers on creating confusion. And I swear to God, it's embarrassing sometimes. We create words for things that already have words. Assumes a process which is probably mistaken, that there's some way in which people come to make decisions. I think maybe in some ways other questions are probably as important, if not more important, like, well, what do people actually decide? And not only that, we've heard this a couple of times today, but why do they decide it? And how are we going to measure those why questions? What do we mean by why? I've been given a talk lately just called Why, because I've been suggesting that the most important questions that we need to sort of ask and answer in natural resources are, what are we going to do? How are we going to do it? And why? And if we fail to ask and satisfactorily answer the why question, we're going to get in trouble for that, and we should get in trouble for that. So why seems to be really important. I don't know about the whole sort of, the making decisions. Maybe it's more important to understand what is a wise decision or a thoughtful decision or intelligent decision. What constitutes an intelligent decision-making process? What would that actually look like? And you might say, well, it looks exactly like what we do now. I doubt it. I know my students wouldn't think that. And there's the word recipe. I mean, as if there's a recipe for this. But while there isn't a recipe, there are clearly better or worse ways that one might go about making decisions and leading decision-making processes. And finally, the sort of dichotomy between what is information or reason or something and emotion we should be very, very careful with that dichotomy. The language we use is really, really important here. I don't think the opposite of a good position is an emotional position. Sometimes when I get a grant rejected, I get angry, but I believe I get angry for a very good reason. So the reason and emotion might not be as dichotomous as we think. We just need different words. If somebody has a dumb position or a bad position, and it's not just emotional, it's just bad, and then we can show why.
I've never had anybody rip so profoundly opposed to talk about it before. Thank you.
This is my title, right? Wasn't it? Or did you?
Oh, Cheryl's typing. But anyway, so so when we think about decisions that really dominate natural resource decision making, they always end with prescriptions. They always end with suggestions about, well, we ought to do something or we ought not to do something. So these are, I mean, all of our conversations about policies and treatments and prescriptions are always, the conclusion of our argument that we're going to present is always prescriptive. We're always suggesting that we ought to do something, or we maybe use the word should. And the thing that we're starting to sort of realize more and more is that, and this is just the structure of an argument, these are premises which are evidence to support a conclusion that we might offer. If you want to have a conclusion that ends in a prescription, by matter of logic, so this isn't my opinion, this is Aristotle's opinion. By matter of logic, you have to have two kinds of premises to support a position like that. You have to have descriptive, empirical premises. This is the realm of science, both biophysical and social science. But you also have to have, or you will have, whether you state them or not, normative or ethical principles. This is what was valuable, this is what's right, this is how the world ought to be. We will try to go to great lengths to not state them, but they're there. And unless we have this all laid out in a transparent fashion, sometimes we don't even know what it is that we disagree on. So I'm going to come back to this structure in a minute. But I think that we recognize this structure, and we try with all of our might to go from P1 to the conclusion, and then get really upset when it doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way because it's not logical. It doesn't mean it's emotional. So you've already learned that. So if I think back about the question, how is it that people make decisions, and especially that P2, that normative ethical, I want to just give you some really basic kinds of frameworks that have sort of come to the forefront in my field, and then we can use these frameworks. It's sort of a taxonomy of values to understand where it is that where are people actually coming from when they make these positions. This really gets to the why question. I didn't think this when I created this. It's starting to seem to me like this is my Christmas tree diagram, or I don't really want it to be. But people, say we should do something or we should not do something for a variety of reasons. Sometimes, when they're interested in ecosystem health, for instance, aren't we all interested in ecosystem health? Well, sure, but I'm not sure that tells us very much. Because you might be interested in ecosystem health because that's how you think humans are provided for. And you and I might not actually share the same value, even though we are interested in ecosystem health, because I might think, oh my God, it's not just humans that matter, it's also species and ecosystems, the land itself that matters. And of course humans matter too. These are accretions. But people could be sort of interested in ecosystem health for a whole bunch of different ethical reasons. And we would, without laying these bare, we would sort of pass one another by. Not everybody's an anthropocentrist. Not everybody's just interested in how things benefit human beings. How you elicit this is not that easy. How do you get people to kind of say, where are you? One way to do it is you just show them something like this and you say point. But we don't even typically have tools like this to point to. It's a different kind of mapping, perhaps. We'd be off in a different kind of conversation. The other thing that's interesting, and this is like 2,500 years of ethical theory in one diagram. I know you sat through semesters of philosophy as undergraduates, and you could have just had this one diagram. It's our little secret. It's how we keep people enrolled. Is when people justify an action or a behavior or a policy, or they're persuaded by the goodness of it, the rightness of it, they evoke different theories, right? Not everybody is a consequentialist. Not everybody thinks, well, what does it do? What's the result of the action? Some people are very utilitarian. Natural resource decision-making is very utilitarian-dominated, or pragmatism. But some people aren't interested in that, or that's only part of what they're interested in. They're also interested in, well, was it virtuous? Respect, humility, care, love. Were those the things that motivated the action? Did you respect the rights of things that possess rights? Did you act out of a sense of duty? Did you follow the commands of a divinity? It's just to sort of round this out. Or did you adhere to the principles of naturalness? And then sometimes we evoke all of these things at the same time, and it's very hard to disentangle these things. It's super hard to disentangle them if we don't even know what the realm is. But knowing this allows us to realize that when people reject or accept a policy or position, that doesn't necessarily mean they're all on the same page, because they might be doing that for very, very different reasons. So let me just give you a couple of examples. And I noticed that when Bruce listed what do people look for when they trust people, he mentioned competence, fairness and equity, shared values, accountability. 3 of the 4 of those things are virtues. A trustworthy person is 3 out of 4 times a person who manifests certain virtues. It's not necessarily about the things that they do on the ground. So here's just a couple of examples really quick. When asked questions, how do people, and they offer an opinion about what we should do, and then if we can think of a way to elicit what moral theory they are evoking to think about that or to justify their action, how does it actually work? It turns out it depends on the question you're asking. So it depends is actually right. But I'll just give you a couple of examples of where we've done this work. So I work on the Isle Royale Wolf Moose Project. It's a long-running predator-prey study. Wolves are at the all-time low, 8 wolves likely to disappear within in a few years. And so it raises a question, should we genetically rescue them? Should we do that? Should we do nothing? Should we genetically rescue them? Should we have a plan to reintroduce them? What should we do? So we actually asked this in a post on the Isle Royale Wolf Moose website. We asked in an open forum whether we should genetically rescue them, and we received 156 comments before the National Park Service ordered us to take it down, which is a wonderful way to confine your data set. Because beyond that, I didn't really want to analyze. And then we came up with a way to kind of code what it was that people said, and we did a content analysis, looking for the ethical theories that they were evoking, not just what they said we should do, but why. What was it about when they justified their action? So one of the things that's interesting is that there were lots of sort of consequentialists sorts of responses, that if you do it, the animals will suffer, or they won't suffer, or this will help something else. It was all about the consequences of doing it or not doing it. And we would expect that. But I think what's interesting is that we might not expect all this other stuff. We might not expect people to speak about natural law. Well, maybe in this case we would. It's about doing what is natural. Even when people spoke about doing what is natural, they didn't agree on what we should do, interestingly. Naturalness didn't seem to get us all that far. Motive, lots of people were interested in abdicating their authority. So treating wolf biologists like God, in a sense, right? It's, well, what does Dave Meach say we should do in this case? Now, if we ask a different question, we get a different breakdown, and that's not as important as the point that our responses to these things vary quite a bit, and they probably are a lot richer than we might think they are. So when a colleague did the same kind of analysis using our coding on this issue in Yellowstone National Park, where wolves injured a moose and sort of went back to try to injure it more day after day after day, right in the Lamar Valley where people were watching, the question came up, and there was a photo essay put in National Geographic, and then there was an open post. Should the Yellowstone National Park rangers have shot the moose, put it out of its misery, and been done? And people offered opinions on that, and they had like 900. They got to have their thing, but we didn't. That's okay. They had to analyze 900 posts, too, and we didn't. But in that case, lots of people evoked natural law theory to try to reason their way through that problem. It's about doing what is natural. Again, they didn't come to an agreement on what we should do, but they used that different theory. Lots of motive, lots of human authority. And look what happens to consequentialism. That kind of approach really got small in this case, and I have no idea why. And if you did this over and over, would you see patterns in natural resource issues? Some kinds evoke this kind of moral theorizing, and other kinds evoke a different kind of moral theorizing. I don't know the answer to that question. So I'm actually really glad that I've been doing the work that I've been doing, and that you guys have been talking about this the way that you have, because for one of the first times in my life, I actually feel like I'm on the same page with everybody else. I want to talk about 2 cases. This is recent work that's not yet published. It's kind of in the works right now. And one is about decisions. How is it that people think we should make decisions? And of course, we can only do this within cases. So it's a case study. And who do people think should make decisions? How comfortable we are with different kind of decision-making models. So I have some data on that. Not a word philosophers typically utter, data. And then I want to talk just quickly about conservation ethics. And I want to use the example of mute swans, an invasive species in Michigan. I just finished a master's student last week who did some work here. And I think this is the one that gives us a kind of model for how we might start to structure different kinds of conversations. So, and we've heard this today, but we haven't heard these fancy words. There are two different ways that we talk about who should make decisions. One is a position called administrative rationalism. This is the example of colleagues making a career out of making up fancy words. So this is the expert technical authority response, right? This is we were just talking about. This is the science-based decision making. So centralized decision making, focus on technical knowledge associated with a decision, minimizes the role of social factors such as public input and stakeholder engagement. That's not what's important here. This is often where we start to talk about best available science, the idea of linking that to the decision. And that contrasts quite often with what's called democratic pragmatism, or what's jokingly called ballot box biology. And this is often seen as a kind of failure, right? When we don't convince the public, what do? They have a referendum. Because they're not convinced. We didn't explain why. And so the decision is made by the people, or when the people say, we should make this decision on the basis of public input. So all of these different words that we use to describe these processes. And the relationship between these things is sort of wonderful to think about. I've been thinking about it all day as we've talked about it. But we did a survey in 2010 in Michigan. So pre-delisting, pre-conversations about hunting wolves in Michigan. So this is about wolves in Michigan. And we only had enough money for 4 questions. And these were, I think last time some of us met, I reported on 2 of them. I'm stretching this out as long as I can. These are the other 2 questions. And they map on really nicely to that distinction. And so we asked people on a 1 to 5 Likert scale, wolves should only be hunted if biologists believe the wolf population can sustain a hunt. So I'm suggesting that sort of goes to this administrative rationalism kind of approach. It's really the biologists, the technocrats of some sort are the people who should be making decisions, versus the decision to hunt wolves should be made by a public vote, which is more that democratic pragmatism. And this is what we discovered in this case, and the cases might vary, no doubt about it. But I don't know what that 10%. So we had 915 people in Michigan. These are phone interviews. 10% didn't like either option. We didn't have another one, so I don't know how they thought decisions should be made. They didn't really seem to trust anybody, the public or the experts. 29% of the people were very sort of happy with experts making the decision. 11% thought it was really a democratic pragmatism, which should be a public vote. And 50% of the people, half of the people, were perfectly comfortable with some sort of a combination of those things. Now, what exactly that would look like, what that process would look like, it's unclear. But people, in other words, half of the people don't necessarily, in this case at least, see those things as at odds with one another. That you can have some sort of a process that does both of those things. And we'd have to, that's interesting. It opens up a possibility for us to think about a little bit. Some of the sort of demographic variations here that are interesting. In general, people who had higher education levels and liberal ideology were more in support of administrative rationalism. They were okay with expert knowledge. And people generally, there was a tendency for democratic pragmatism, public votes for people who with less formal education and a firmer commitment to conservative ideology. Interestingly as well, and we have to go back and think about this, there's an interesting disconnect at times between people's preferred method of decision-making and what they actually want to happen. And so there are people who, for instance, want a wolf hunt, but they will decide they prefer a process that likely will not get them one. When if they decided on the other process, if they decided on the technical process, leave it up to the Michigan DNR, they're more likely to get what they want. So it's unclear what that is. Is that social identity that overrides your actual preference at the end of the day, that I identify as this kind of a person and I therefore identify with this kind of a process no matter what? Or, yeah, what's going on there? So there's often a disconnect. It was a pretty strong disconnect in certain cases. So people don't necessarily just pick the method that will get them what they want, in other words. So the last one, my student Corey Jager just finished this project on mute swans, and one of the things we wanted to do is combine some social science with some ethics. And one of the things, this is an emerging issue, right? So mute swans are thought to be kind of invasive, and the question from the Michigan DNR is, should we start controlling them? Should we start shooting them, essentially? Part of it was how to control them as well, but should we engage in control? So this was something that was emerging, and we wanted to know what arguments were going to persuade people. What arguments that were going to sort of float up and actually be the persuasive arguments that we were going to see, and what arguments should persuade people. So part of it is description of this emerging problem, but also part of it is an evaluation. Are we going to be persuaded by bad arguments? Well, we won't know that unless we do an argument analysis. So we did a social science analysis, and then that allowed us to do an argument analysis, which I guess is really what this slide is. So what she did is she just started paying attention to newspaper articles, did some research to suggest that that's where people still get information, especially about political issues that are local, and started to code these articles and started to see what are the reasons that people were offering for controlling mute swans and against controlling mute swans. And we started sort of iteratively working on this code book. And so over time, it was actually really interesting. When she decided to stop coding, the stories actually stopped about mute swans. It was very, very fortuitous, I guess. But you have to end it somewhere. And so these were just the occurrences of these articles over time. These were the 3 most popular arguments in favor of management and 3 most popular arguments opposed to management. These were how often, the numbers are how often those were mentioned in these articles. And actually right at the sort of base of 3, they kind of fell off. So the idea is that these are the ones that are likely going to persuade people, because these are the ones we're seeing all the time. And this is just sort of how frequent they were over time, because at one point, somebody was checking a mute swan nest. The mute swan came at him. He fell out of his boat and he drowned. And so that has the potential to really change the whole dynamic of the debate. It didn't, interestingly, but it could have. So people are like, oh, mute swans are drowning people. Yeah, might be some issues with causation there, but so we have the dominant codes just sort of showing how often they appear, and then what she did is you take, and I'll just give you an example of one. People don't speak like this, unfortunately. They don't say premise 1, premise 2, conclusion. They just say things. And so they give reasons for positions, but a reason for a position can be turned into an argument. And so that's where actually the really, really difficult work comes in. And so this is just an example of where you're going to have, if you're going to say we should or should not do something, you're going to have both the empirical premise and the normative premise. Even if people don't say it, you have to fill it in. What needs to be true in order for that conclusion to be true? Great exercise in empathy here to try to understand what it is that people are actually saying, because they don't say all of these things necessarily. And then once you have that, you have an argument, and once you have an argument, and you fill it out fully, because they often get elaborate, you can analyze them. Arguments can be wrong because you can have a mistaken premise, right, a factual mistake, or you can make a mistake in an inference. And then you can play, I wouldn't call these games, but there are ways to really think hard about the arguments that people offer. We can think about, whose realm of expertise is each one of these premises? Is it a scientific claim? Is it a natural science claim? Is it a social science claim? Is it an economics claim? Is it an ethical claim? So where's the realm of expertise? Is it true or not? Do we know the answer to these questions? And very, very importantly, that's different than whether or not it's controversial. Because we can have very true claims that are still very controversial. Their controversiality does not make them untrue. It just makes them controversial. It means our work is not about the truth. It's not about doing more science. It's about communicating it or something like that. So you can sort of fill out these tables. You could do this, of course, as a group exercise. In fact, I guess in some ways we did, because it was a committee of people that were working on this. The thing that's interesting about this method of decision making is it's not about me trying to get you to do something. It's about me and you looking at the whiteboard together and sketching this stuff out, trying to figure out what is it that we should do. So it's about discovery. It's not about sort of, telling other people what to do necessarily, which is, I think, a very different model of decision making. And I think what you start to see over time is that there are patterns. Sure, this is about mute swans, but the basic form of that argument will show up over and over and over again. Just in Michigan, we see examples of the arguments that she's analyzing just show up over and over and over again. And we start to get familiar with this method of argument analysis. So here's a couple other examples. The other thing it does is it allows us to prioritize our research. So if we say, what research would be really important? Well, I don't know, what policy are people proposing? How would you build the argument? And is one of those premises, does it scream for, in one of those boxes to say, we don't know the answer to that? Well, that tells me that bit of research is actually really, really important. And the nuances of how I would sort of word it or structure it would change depending on how I filled out that argument table as well. So I like the fact that it can help us target research needs in a more directed way. So again, those are just a couple of examples of this fusion, and that's the questioning moose. Monkeys de moose. I didn't plan it like that. So I'll end there.
That's your ending. The ending moose.
The ending moose.
Questions for Michael? I need to run back and redo your IDT process.
That is.
I have a quick question about attitude. So, and what role attitude might play in the way that you can make decisions, because the attitude research pretty strongly suggests that, there's this concept of ambivalence, that people can hold two very, almost diametrically opposed attitudes simultaneously. And sometimes one gets enacted and sometimes another gets enacted. And it's not clear to me that there's any way to predict how that's going to happen. So what role does ambivalence play?
Yeah, people are weird.
Yeah, people are unpredictable.
Yeah, and we're all weird too, because we do that as well. I mean, we're very pluralistic, and so one of the things, if I think about the analyzing the content, the question about genetically rescuing Isle Royal wolves, I mean, if you added up those things, they didn't add up right, is because in any one post from any one person, they don't evoke just one moral theory to reason their way through it. So what we did was, do we see a utilitarian appeal? Yes. In the same post, you might see a different kind of appeal. Now, is there a way to kind of remedy or work through that? I suppose. I mean, if you wrote that post, right, and then you showed it to me, I probably would start asking you questions. And I'd want to know, well, what's really driving? What I see is you have two attitudes or two theories. Put them into boxes, and would you set them right next to each other? Would you prioritize them in some way? I think that I might be naive, but I have a lot of faith in just our ability to make some progress if we're just clear, if we can be more clear and we can have that conversation honestly. And then I think what you'd have to do, because I asked you, is you'd have to tell me, well, I guess I really mean this one. And all of a sudden now we gain some clarity. It's not that the other one isn't important to me. It's just in this case it takes the back seat. And we'd start to, incrementally make some progress in that conversation. I saw another question, then the people changed their mind.
Well, how would we lend more clarity to our decisions and our rationale to explain decisions without hiring the philosopher?
You have no idea how cheap philosophers are.
Do you have any ideas in terms of how we explain a decision, or how we even go about it, that would be simple ways that we could be clearer?
Yeah.
I think your argument that this is about clarity and the underlying whys, I think, is really important.
Yeah. I think really what I'm describing is critical thinking, and in its most very, very rudimentary form, critical thinking. And so the expectation of critical thought and reflection and then expression is something, I mean, people won't say things like, oh, I'm not interested in critical thinking. I mean, they might, but you mark yourself as weird when you do things like that. But I do think it has to be something that I mean, I'd have to think about that. I'd have to have a specific sort of example in front of me, and then I think through a conversation, we probably could come up with a way to go about doing that. But I mean, that's also, I mean, I think one of the things that Cheryl hoped for here is that we start to see that there are people who have suites of tools that we could collaborate with to think of these things. So, I mean, that's one of my interests is collaborating with people on these topics.
I think I have a suggestion. Could you go back to the slide, the first mute swan slide? Yeah.
Oh, the actual argument?
Yeah.
Oh.
Okay, stop.
Yeah.
So in putting these things together, we spend so much time on the empirical, and we've heard the difference between wickedness and complexity. And every time I've heard somebody reiterate what wickedness is, they just mean more complex and more complex. And it's not. This is what wickedness is. It's the value judgment. And it's this component right here. You can collect all the data you want. So I think it's important, Meg, to lay out, here's what we know about this problem. Here's how different values are coming into play before we come to this conclusion. And putting it out there and bearing your soul, I guess.
And sometimes what we see is, I mean, you know, what we get weird about those kinds of premises because we think, oh, geez, we're going to be in this realm where people don't agree. I mean, as if they agree on premise one there. Come on. But that's not really true. I mean, lots of our ethical arguments are going to have, you know, crazy controversial ethical premises like we shouldn't do harm to children. I mean, it's often the case when we lay these things out that the ethical premises are sometimes more clear than the scientific premises are, and that we shouldn't be afraid of that transparency. Not always, but we'd start to see very clearly, are we in really controversial territory here or not? And then we'd start to codependent programmers. I think now I'm supposed to say something about that.
You know, I thought it was interesting when you were talking about the, and I can't remember the terms. If somebody's deciding like it's a rational authority, or
I can't remember them either.
or the administrative rationalism and a democratic pragmatism, I think there might be a relationship too, especially if the specific issue is spelled out, as far as is there trust in the authority. If I, like, say, I work for the BLM, but if I'm Jill Public and I'm ticked off at something the BLM does, no matter how expert the opinions of the folks might really be in reality, I may have a very different outlook, and maybe in some ways I might trust scientific authorities in general more than thinking that everybody should vote for something. But if I don't trust that particular agency, do you think there was a relationship based on that specific issue because the authority was spelled out and maybe people had a problem?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
So you mentioned earlier today something about mandates, right? So there's this, I mean, thinking about those two, the relationship between those two things is really interesting because if I'm going to be crude here, if I'm pretending, right, that this is this bottom-up process, but in reality it's going to be top-down, the moment somebody senses that, you just lost their trust. I mean, just think about yourself, how you would react to that. So the transparency of it, you shouldn't hide it because it's clear that 50% of the people don't have a problem with some relationship between those things. So being transparent about, so here's how this process works. We are under certain constraints. And that, you know, that doesn't mean that whatever we vote on today will be enacted. But to reach that, we do have some leeway within that. And we can have this bottom-up process and just keep pointing that out, that these things are in conversation with one another. Again, I think it's the transparency that saves us at the end of the day. It certainly saves our trust in the long run at the end of the day.
Going back to that new swan slide, the first thing basically is our existing condition, and then the second one we use is our desired condition, and the third thing is the purposeful need for the projects. That's what we use in our NEPA steps, sort of.
There's a parallel to that. I mean, yeah, and it should be the case that if what I'm talking about is critical thinking, you shouldn't respond by saying, wow, I've never seen anything like that. there's no. I think if that's your response, I think we're doomed. But there should be these parallels that we see, and they might not be exactly the same, but they should be close. That we are sort of thinking our way, systematically, rigorously through a certain process.
When he gave his talk at the Penn Shadow with the planner at the BLM, is she still in here? She saw this table as being exactly what you do when you process public comment. So it's the same sort of, so parallels is, where are they coming from? Is it true, or is it just an opinion? And how controversial is it? Does it raise it up to where we might want to reconsider or not?
I think sometimes in laying out our reasons or premise for an action, we tend to shy away from the ethicity of it because we're scientists and we want to, don't go there. So that's something that might be allowed to review that I thank you for.
Yeah. But it's interesting because we're going to go somewhere that's prescriptive at the end of the day. So getting better at that relationship seems to, whether we have to do that individually or we need to collaborate more to do that. Rachel Carson and Aldo Leopold could do it by themselves, but I'm not them. So, I have to have friends to do this stuff. Which means I have to be a lot nicer than I would otherwise like to be.
What I'm struggling with in this discussion is that in our realm, regardless of how we come up with a decision, if there's disagreement, it's going to end up where? In the courts. And someone will authoritatively make a decision based on the science and data.
Or that's how they'll report it. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. No, we do have these words like objectivity and science-based that partly we mean something by them and partly we just use them as weapons and we use them inconsistently and all kinds of things. So there's certainly a lot of work to do there. I think Dale pointed out that one of the things that we have learned in social science is that even if people don't agree with the outcome, if they feel like they were part of the process, they're much more likely to accept it. And there's a great salvation in that recognition. And there's, over and over again, because it's a hard one to swallow, that it's not really, in some ways, it's not just about the consequences, it's about the process that seems to allow people to accept it or reject it.
When we end up in court, though, or have disagreements like that, although people are saying their science is why we're not right, they're picking their science to support their ethics.
That's often the case. Yeah. Or at least, again, by being really transparent, we'd be able to show that. If the science is controversial, if it's uncertain and controversial, that means it could go one way or another, and then the whole argument sort of trickles out that way. And you can demonstrate that in a very linear, rigorous fashion, the exact fashion that scientifically minded people demand.
And that's why collaboration is so important, to get at the ethical, the personal value side of things rather than the science-based argument.
Yeah, I collaborate with two really good social scientists and a really good ecologist, and so what I'm doing here is it's social science work using ethical frameworks but around ecological issues. So it's those three things put together somehow, and it's hard enough to get good at one of them, but all three was nearly impossible.
The thing I'm not seeing in here is the continual learning from experiences that is additive. Specifically, if you do monitoring work and do that in a public venue where it's group learning, that's how you move forward, I think. Or I just wonder why that's not in there. So, that continual learning information that is just vital to get a collaborative group into that mode.
Yeah, it's because we don't know about it, right? So one thing that we really don't know, this would be if anybody'd like to fund a graduate student, we don't actually know if you sort of take people through a process like this, what will they think? What will they? How they judge? We have no idea. We've barely done this stuff at this point. This is new, so we really don't know. How do people react to, reason? And it hasn't really occurred to me because on the one hand I want to say, well, that's a silly question. Of course they're going to be positively predisposed toward reason. The one group of people that we've seen, and this is just anecdotal, who are most uneasy with a process like this are people who already believe they get to make the decisions. So if they already believe they get to make the decisions and they remain relatively unscathed, that might be a very small group of people, they're like, yeah, I'm not interested in democratizing decision-making and reason and ethics. They're already in the driver's seat. They often don't voice that because it's a weird thing to voice. But they're the one sort of group of people that at meetings will kind of look around like, oh crap, this could change everything. But yeah, we don't know very much about perceptions of this as a process for decision making. Thanks everyone.